My name is Jane Moore. I'm a woman in my 60s. I won't say older yet. I use she, her pronouns. I have my hair pulled back, which is kind of brown and gray. I have a black shirt on. And my co-presenter is Lucas. And Lucas, do you want to just describe yourself and then we'll get going?
Yes, thank you, Jane. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Lucas Cuellar. I am in my 40s, although everybody tells me I look much younger, and I have short, dark brown hair. I'm wearing black rimmed glasses and a plaid shirt today. Thank you all for being here.
Yes, and welcome. Thank you. Thank you, Lucas. And thank you all. You may know or not that this is the first in a series of three webinars. This one being an overview of Disability Rights Maine and our employment advocacy. Next week, we're having one that talks about the VR process and navigating the VR process. And then the following Wednesday, I believe the 29th, we're talking about post-secondary accommodations. We're doing it in October because it's National Disability Employment Awareness Month. So um, yeah, I think we can get going. As Harper said, the question and answers, if possible, we'd like to leave them to the end because, for one thing, I can't see any of you, which is kind of weird. I've never done that, and it might be just for time's sake, might be better to do it that way. As for myself, I've worked for Disability Rights Maine for 8.5 years or so. I've been in the disability rights I've been in disability rights work for many, many years, starting in Chicago with our sister agency at Chicago Disability Rights Maine. Lucas, anything you want to say, and then we'll get going?
I will just say, I think Jane and I both have background and training as in legal practice and are currently working as advocates with Disability Rights Maine. I am glad to be moving into advocacy with the client assistance program. So, um, yeah, and I think if you all have any questions for us, definitely put them in the Q&A, and we will also make sure you have our emails addresses so you can contact us after the presentation. As we go forward, just some kind of things to be keeping in your mind to think about. What are some barriers to employment that you're seeing for yourself or you know of that maybe friends or colleagues have gone through or in your work with your clients? Um, and then are there any what would be considered unique employment goals that you all have had or someone you're supporting has? And this is our uh, what I refer to as the disclaimer slide. So every we are going to be talking about some legal information today, but the material we're talking about is presented for education purposes, and it is not legal advice. Um, Neither Jane nor I would be able to offer anything resembling legal advice in this forum. And definitely, if you do have, specific legal questions, please do reach out to us through our intake or contact an attorney for legal advice. Also, this material is current as of today. As you all are probably aware, laws and regulations can change very rapidly. And so, if you are relying on any of this material in the future, please do confirm that it is still current information. And then know that we are happy to provide any information we can if you need to reach out to us in the future to do that. But if you're using it, it would be your responsibility to confirm that it is current. Thank you. Uh, so, who is Disability Rights Maine? This is our mission. Disability Rights Maine advances justice and equality by enforcing rights and expanding opportunities for people with disabilities in Maine. Um, we are the designated protection and advocacy agency for the state of Maine. So, what that means is we're part of a network of protection and advocacy agencies across the United States. Um, we are one of, I believe, 52. And each state has their own designated protection and advocacy agency. So, as Jane mentioned, previously working in another protection and advocacy agency in a different state, something that I think is really vital about the work or the formation of the protection and advocacy agencies is that we are required to have at least 51% of the board be people with disabilities themselves. And we are a nonprofit. DRM, Disability Rights Maine, is Maine's only cross-disability advocacy organization, and we do operate statewide. Disability.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say we were founded in 1977, and we've grown significantly since then. And we have 2 primary offices, but we have staff really all over the state. Thank you, Jane.
And just additionally, we came about, the National Protection Advocacy System came about as a result of conditions in a hospital in upstate New York, Willowbrook. Some of you may be familiar with that. The conditions were so horrendous, and Geraldo Rivera did a expose on that. I don't know if people are old enough to remember him. But anyway, as a result, it got the attention of the legislation, and legislation was created. The first federal project, the federal funding, was the protection and advocacy of individuals with developmental disabilities. And from there, we've expanded. We're going to talk today about 2 of our federal programs, but we have quite a few, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So, okay, so go, this is you. Lucas.
Okay, so we have identified at Disability Rights Maine key areas in which we want to focus, which we term priority areas, and they are on the slide. But essentially, the purpose of these priorities is to help us drive our work, and we do that with the input of people with disabilities across the state.
So I'm embarrassed to say that was actually Lucas may have looked a little surprised, but that actually is the slide I was prepared to do. So I'll go ahead, Lucas, if you don't mind.
Please.
So one of our priority areas, and actually the most important one in many ways, and because of the Willowbrook situation, became one of the most the bedrock of the disability rights movement, is to eliminate abuse, neglect, and exploitation, and especially in facilities like Willowbrook. You may know that Disability Rights Maine also was involved in the closure of AMHI, the Augusta Mental Health Institute, and that is directly a result of this priority area. So we continue to monitor the institutions, such as the one in Bangor, the Dorothea Dix, as well as Riverview, and any other location where people with disabilities are basically in an institution or facility, such as group homes or other such things. One of our priorities is to reduce the use of guardianship. Guardianship in Maine is used at twice the rate of anywhere else in the country, so that's pretty significant. And often, I think people resort to guardianship sometimes when lesser restrictive means can be done to assist someone in making their own decisions. Guardianship is a very restrictive practice, so we try to help people move away from guardianship and into supported decision making, for example, or other ways that can help people make their own decisions. And we all do that every day, so it's important to let everybody do that. We also try to improve access to disability-related services. I know when I was working with the mental health team, we did a lot helping people access case management if that was something they wanted. But important to that is also access to due process. Everybody, despite having a disability, we all know that due process is a bedrock of our country, and having the ability to challenge in a equitable way things that happen to you is part of that. Um, Probably the most germane to the day is increased access to competitive and integrated employment. And that's something we're going to talk more about today. We also have a group, we have people that challenge housing discrimination based upon disability. Um, we have an education section that works with youth on increasing access to inclusive education. And we have especially this time of year, we have a very busy uh, group of people working on access to voting. In fact, the last few years, we've gone out to so many polls just to monitor to be sure people have access to the voting machines that people use who have impairment reading difficulties, or in making sure that the access to the voting area is accessible by people in wheelchairs, all of those things. And I think we've made some great progress. We've worked with the Secretary of State on that, and I think that what we've done with that is very successful in there. So our service in generally are, we go from the least involved to most, but we try to help everybody. Unfortunately, we have limited resources, as all programs do, but we have a budget that's not always adequate to serve everybody. But our primary thing is we will talk to everybody and we will provide something. And that something oftentimes it's just information referral, but every case that comes in, we look at individually. We don't have a phone tree. Someone answers the phone. You're going to talk to an advocate or an intake specialist for at least a half hour. That case will then go to an attorney or the team lead and be looked at and decide how much more we can do, if anything. But usually at the very minimum, we're going to provide information referral. The next step would be individual advocacy, where we actually take on the case and try to assist someone in getting what they're looking for. If it's something we can advocate for, or we can assist someone in self-advocacy, which you'll see later down on this list. Legal representation, we have lawyers, and as a result, we often have cases that go to court, or at least start that process and get into some sort of formal mediation. As you can see today, we do training. Often we do a lot of it because we need to get the word out, and this is the best way to reach many people. I said earlier, we assist with self-advocacy. I think everybody is the most powerful way to get something done, and it also can when you develop those skills, self-advocacy is something you can carry on into other aspects of your life. And finally, we do the outreach and monitoring. And one of the unique things about the protection advocacy system is that we have a unique thing to be access to places where people with disabilities are living or working or recreating. And as a result, we can go into places like psychiatric hospitals or group homes and community support programs to give information about us and to make sure the conditions are good for the individuals who are living there or working there. We also do a lot of outreach into the community, and I just did that. I didn't mean to. And as a result, we get to see a lot of people at fairs even, or different ways to get the word out that we exist. And I think that's the most important thing, is people know that we're here in case they need it. So the process generally is someone might call Disability Rights Maine, the individual with the disability. Although if someone else calls on their behalf, we will certainly listen and take, but we will definitely need to talk to the individual with the disability or communicate in some way with that individual. We have an online form that you can fill out as well as a phone call. Then we probably will talk, at least as I said, for a half hour. That case will be summarized and given to an attorney and have a discussion. If we're going to go forward, or if we need to get more information, we'll obviously get releases from the client to gather that information. And then we're going to either, we'll do some informal advocacy, or we'll move on into direct representation. Sometimes for the employment world, that might just be some sort of technical assistance or contacting others to help them navigate a dispute, or attend meetings with the client to negotiate a resolution. What is really important, and sometimes, especially if another person calls us for assistance for someone, is that we are always going to be working on the client's express interest. The person with the disability will guide our work. We will talk to that individual. If that individual wants others to be part of that, that's great. But that individual will guide the work we do. We aren't looking out for the best interest, which might sound horrible, but the fact is, we want that individual to have the power to decide what is good for them or not. Obviously, some people will have guardians, until that may require them to be involved, but not always. So we really want to make sure that client is self-determining what goes on with our representation. briefly, you can call to schedule an intake on here. This is a scan for that, and we're going to go over it pretty quickly, so you probably won't be able to take a picture of it right now. But if you go to our website, www.drme.org, there'll be an online intake as well as contact information. Now we're going to get in the nuts and bolts of employment advocacy.
So today we're going to discuss two specific federal programs that allow us or support us to do employment advocacy work. And I think if there is an employment issue that any of you hear about or are facing, it's really up to us to kind of figure out how we can best serve that and meet that advocacy need. So don't worry about, as we go through and describe these programs, don't worry about if you're requesting assistance saying, oh, I'm going to request it from this program or that program. If you're having an employment issue, just give us a call and do an intake and we'll figure out where it goes. So some of the common reasons that we see of people who contacting us for employment assistance or employment advocacy assistance are just communication issues with VR. Sometimes disagreements with decisions that were made or delays in services, payments, or referrals. So that could be, somebody has expressed that they want to get a job and they were told or somebody suggested referring that individual to vocational rehab, and there's some sort of delay there, or they're not able to get in touch with their VR counselor, something like that. We also get contacted when there's confusion about the process. What's the timeline? What's supposed to be happening next? And as I'm sure you all are aware, there has been sort of a delay in the provision of VR services that is just seems to be due to the volume and not because anybody is trying to put up barriers. But that can be really frustrating if you're waiting for the next step. And sometimes you just don't know what's going on, and we get called in those situations as well. Often there are needs for accommodations. So we get calls about assistance with accessing those accommodations for work or school. We do also assist with navigation of if there was an overpayment by the Social Security Administration or where somebody needs education about their benefits. And then, of course, we also get calls about potential employment discrimination. So sort of an array of different issues, all relating to accessing work or school. And I mentioned there are two federal programs we're going to talk about today. One of them is the Client Assistance Program, or CAP. It's a federally funded program, and it's designed to support people with disabilities and enforce rights of people with disabilities under the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. And it really is about accessing vocational rehab services. So CAP can provide information about vocational rehabilitation services and the processes around those services. Also, the state rehab councils help. We do a lot of self-advocacy assistance, right, and technical assistance. So that means helping people understand their rights and responsibilities and how to navigate the services that they're being provided or they're eligible for. We also do individual cases where we work to resolve barriers to employment in various ways and various kinds of barriers. And we do a systemic advocacy if we're seeing, a trend of similar issues. We will kind of think about how we can approach it from a systemic standpoint as well. there are requirements about when people accessing vocational rehabilitation services are supposed to be informed about the client assistance program. So this slide is talking about, vocational rehab's obligations. We also do outreach and, try to spread the word as much as possible that the client assistance program exists and that Disability Rights Maine does employment advocacy every time we're talking to people and the outreach or monitoring or even individual cases that we have. But for VR, their obligation is to provide information about the client assistance program at the initial contact or application phase, when they're determining the eligibility of the individual for services and the order of selection, when there is an individual plan for employment or an IPE developed, and if there are ever denials, reduction, or termination of services.
The other federal program that is just about employment is the protection and advocacy for beneficiaries of Social Security, which is shortened to PABS. And it is also a federally funded program, but it is to support people with disabilities that receive SSI, SSDI in removing barriers to employment. I did want to add, though, that if an individual calls us and has a barrier to employment, it does not receive SSI or SSDI. Employment is a part of all of our programs. The mental health team can work on employment. The people who work on with brain injury can work on employment. But actually, the federally funded program that we're talking about today are for those who receive SSI and SSDI, and to remove any barriers to employment. So we kind of ask a rhetorical question here, but what are some barriers to employment that you or your clients have SSI or SSDI are experiencing? As you can imagine, there's quite a few. Some of the things, and we're going to have some case examples that might illustrate that. Some of the things we've done or we can do is we can also work with VR and help with that process. We can help people understand work incentives that might exist because of their receiving SSI or SSDI. We can talk about their rights in the conditions of employment or under the ADA. We've helped people get accommodations under the ADA. We can help people with housing or transportation, which might seem kind of, how does that fit in here? But actually, is that if that serves to be a barrier to employment, we can assist. And what's unique about this program is that, like, say someone is facing an eviction, it does not necessarily have to be because of their disability. So if it is a barrier to employment, we can assist with that. We can't do them all, obviously, because of our resources, but we will definitely look into it and see if we can help in some way, because the goal for all of us and all of you probably is to get people access to employment and do what they would like to do and move on. We also, we do give some advice how to navigate different systems, including the Ticket to Work program or employment networks. So it's a kind of a broad program, but the only limiting factor is that the individuals we would work with have SSI or SSDI as disability benefits.
And if I can just say one more
Sure.
thing about that, I think that is the essential difference between the PABS program and the CAP program. CAP is not limited to people receiving SSI or SSDI, but it is limited to people receiving vocational rehab services. Rehab services or eligible for vocational rehab services. So, as Jane mentioned, we're going to talk about some case examples, and these are examples of cases that we have provided individual advocacy with. And you can sort of see that there'll be like a variety of levels of intervention that the advocate took. So we had a case for a young adult who had a disability. That disability happened to be a traumatic brain injury, but it is not material what the disability was, really. So this individual had requested our assistance with getting back in touch with their VR counselor and getting some clarity on what exactly the scope of services were that vocational rehab was going to provide. There was some concerns that the client didn't believe that their VR counselor respected their self-employment goal, and they had been assigned a business mentor, that they were also having concerns, similar concerns, that they were not respecting their individual self-employment goal. And this was causing a breakdown in communication, as may be fairly that would follow. If I'm working with somebody and I don't believe they're listening, it's very hard to maintain communication. So the advocate discussed the client's concerns with the counselor and invited them to a team meeting to see if they could move the services forward. And after the meeting, VR services were restarted, and there was a vocational assistive technology assessment. The client successfully secured around $2,000 of assistive technology through their individualized plan for employment. And they were able to get back to us that the communication had improved. They better understood what services were available to them, and the case was able to be concluded.
Another example, and this has to do with someone who has an employment goal, which is everybody has their goals of what they want to do to go back to work. So this individual was a young adult and they had an intellectual disability, and they had contacted Disability Rights Maine for assistance because they wanted to change that goal. The goal they were doing was pushing carts in parking lots, and they wanted to work with soundboards, which has to do with music and performance. Excuse me. So we got involved and we raised the request to change their employment goal with vocational rehab, and learned that the client was assigned a new counselor, which was good news to, good information for that client to have, because they weren't aware of that. So then Disability Rights Maine supported their client at their initial meeting to revise their individual's employment plan. As a result, and again, they had a new VR counselor, so it happened pretty easily, but the meeting, they raised those interests and their experience with broadcasting and their love of sports. So they were thinking of being sports announcers, and the new VR counselor immediately thought of ideas in the surrounding area, including a new stadium that could be a good place to explore opportunities in. So obviously that the connection existed there. The VR counselor made the necessary steps to do so. And the client then shared with us that they were happy with the plan moving forward. And it's not, sometimes we get involved and it's not that we're moving mountains. Sometimes it's just one more step into the process, and then it's the individual, the VR in this case, takes it forward and it goes forward to that. And then we end up closing the case. So it's not always a huge, I think one of the things I've noticed is I'm going in and talk to people about their rights and talking to VR counselors or case managers as such, and they always think that we're going to be adversarial. I mean, we would ideally like to work together and get it to help the client get what they're looking for. Obviously, we answer to the client, but if there's a way that we can push forward through the system that already exists, that's ideal for us too, and it's easier for the client too. So. This is a transportation case? Yes. Okay.
Yes. Yep. So I was just giving the interpreters a moment to.
Oh, I can't see them, so thank you.
Yeah. So this is another case. This involved transportation in kind of two ways. That we had a client who was a young adult who had reached out to Disability Rights Maine because they wanted to access driver's ed. And they also wanted to make sure that they had transportation from their community support program to the work trial location. And vocational rehab had initially not been willing to provide that transportation. So the Disability Rights Maine advocate was able to contact the vocational rehab counselor, and they were able to coordinate local transportation between the trial work site and the community support program so that our client could start their work trial again. And when we followed up with that individual, they were waiting for their driving simulation technology so that they could get ready to meet the prerequisites to access driver's ed. and they were happy with the transportation from the community support program to the work location. So essentially, what was probably maybe a phone call from us was able to kind of keep things moving in the direction where this individual could get the transportation and access to the education that they wanted.
So I'm going to give a couple other examples. One of the things about the three we had before is there's no mention that they're receiving SSI or SSDI benefits. If they were, and any of those cases we just talked about could be also done by the advocacy in the PABS program. Honestly, it doesn't. It only matters in that we have to receive documentation when people use SSI and SSDI. The approach would be very much the same because we're all there to work towards employment, and it's really the only piece there is we're going to have to get that verification, which is kind of it's not ideal because we actually have to have the individual provide that with us, but we'll help with that. That's one of the things we will do is help the person access their benefits letter or how, different ways to get it, set up an account with Social Security so they can get informed about different changes in their situation and report wages. So I think that those three cases would be potentially those for the PABS program as well if the individuals were receiving SSI and SSDI. Of course, we didn't put that in those. So let's say a woman is receiving her SSDI benefits and she requested an accommodation so she could continue working at her current employment. So she already works. So one of the things about the PABS program is we not only help people find work, we can help people continue to work and perhaps be promoted in their works and maintain their work. So it's all aspects of the employment process. So she wanted to keep working where she is, but she felt she would not be able to or would jeopardize her health because of the situation, and I can't really go into specifics because of the identifying factors, but the situation that the employer was refusing to provide her with an accommodation for. So this was a barrier to work. As I mentioned, for the PABS program, there has to be a barrier, and the lack of this accommodation was a barrier. So we contacted, she had done her best to try to do the process, did a lot of self-advocacy, but hadn't gone anywhere. She had asked for the accommodation from the Human Resources Department, and they had said no. So we contacted the Human Resource Department and asked for a meeting to continue what's called the interactive process, which is part of the ADA, and that's to figure out what kind of accommodation would work. So we discussed that with the individual as well as the HR department and the owner of the establishment, and kind of had both sides explain their perspective, which was great because then the woman could explain why she needed that accommodation, and actually the employer could also explain why they initially had denied it. And we were able to come up with a plan that worked for her. So after we gave it a 1 month trial for both sides, and we met, and the woman continues to be successfully employed and is quite satisfied with how it came out. Another example is a person who was receiving SSI, and they wanted to go to work, but they had been discharged from their case management services. And thus they felt that their disorganization in their life that they result from the discharge from case management was a barrier to their work. So we got involved in this, and we assisted the woman in establishing a relationship with a new agency, and we got a new case manager. Remember I said that other programs in our agency could do employment jobs. This could have easily been done by our mental health team, but the individual, I worked with her, but it could have been done there too. So if we could spread employment work throughout our agency. So with that new case manager, the woman was able to reestablish with a VR counselor again, and then a new IPE was created, which included goals that were fitting with her interests. So, in that case, it was made kind of just getting access to services that would made it so she could actually look for work. I wonder if we could see if there's any questions before we get into the next section, because those are our examples. And as I said, I don't see anything, but if there's something in the chat or if there's anybody who wants to raise their hand, Harper, do you have any access to that? Harper?
Harper. There are not currently any content questions or in the chat, and I don't see any hands raised.
Okay, thanks.
Another minute, maybe, but keep on going. I'll let you know if I see any.
All right, thank you. I guess, some of this stuff might be other things that people know already about Disability Rights Maine, but we're starting here. And as we said, the next two sessions will be probably have a little bit more content in terms of the the legal start part or the law. So, okay. So,
So I think in particular, um, well, we get a lot of questions sort of about how our involvement works, and our advocates and attorneys are unique oftentimes to people's support teams because we come in and out and it's issue specific. So with regard to employment advocacy, I think there's not necessarily a requirement that we would inform all individuals that we've talked to or worked with on a case that the case is closed. It really depends on our client and the level of service that we've provided. So we do always notify that individual, of course, when we are closing a case or we've concluded an advocacy issue. And we do work by cases. So it would be, we may have a client with concerns in a number of areas. We may open a case about one of those concerns, and that would be the thing we work on. And then we conclude that when we're able to hopefully reach a good resolution. We always hope for a good resolution. The other question is, will the employment advocate from Disability Rights Maine participate in every client meeting when the case is open? And the answer is not always. I think we have a specific, like I said, case specific and issue specific work. So for example, if we're working on the case that Jane was just talking about the client who needed to reestablish case management services, we wouldn't necessarily be going to other meetings about other services unless that individual needed a particular advocacy and we were able to assist with that. And I have come from work with adults with labels of intellectual disability or autism. So those, there's a lot of support team people around those clients and a lot of meetings that need to happen that may or may not have anything to do with the advocacy issue. So always, if the individual client wants us to attend a meeting, they should make that request of us, and we can kind of talk through what's the best way to meet the goals that they have for our advocacy or for advocacy in general at that meeting. Also, we are always looking to collaborate with other organizations and work on, make forays into our systemic advocacy work. So most of the time that systemic advocacy begins with an individual case or, reports of particular issues in particular locations. If you or a client you have is noticing potential employment or education discrimination, please consider referring them to us for an intake. We do go through our intake process and, screen to make sure that we can provide the assistance needed. But definitely don't hesitate to reach out if you are experiencing employment discrimination, if you're concerned about employment discrimination, or if you're experiencing barriers to working. Also, if you're interested in getting involved in advocacy, you could consider joining the state rehabilitation councils. And as I understand it, there are several of them. So that could be something that provides a place for sort of more systemic advocacy to solve, issues with the system as it is.
Before we end, I just want to highlight a couple things. First, we are statewide. I think that's important to know. We have advocates. We have an advocate up in the county area. We have a lot of advocacy in Bangor. We're down in York County. with after the pandemic, we've got to use a lot of Zoom and this type of presentation. But if the individual would feel better about us meeting with for them in person, we are usually willing to do so. We are willing to do so. It just might take a little bit of, figuring out logistically how to do it. But we would be available to meet with them in person, or with you in person. It's kind of hard to know what it's a very mixed audience here today. So we're not trying to say one or the other, but I know some of you are people with disabilities who might be interested in work. Some of you are case managers, and some are you are community members, and perhaps some of you are involved in VR or other aspects of employment. So I just want to emphasize that we are available to go places as well. We're also available to do trainings places. We do have individuals sitting on the Independent Living Council. So we're around. I'm fairly new to this type of work, and thus I'm having a little, I'm getting to know people, as I think Lucas will be too. But we have a history of doing this, and we're excited to be part of it. And I personally am quite excited to do this kind of work because it's very positive and it's very fulfilling for individuals we're working with, as well as myself, because I love to see people progress into something that they like to do. So with that said, Lucas, any last words before we go into the questions? And if there were, obviously there weren't any, so we might end a little short, but anything else you would like to say, Lucas?
No, I think we do have at least one question in the Q&A now.
Okay.
Um, and Harper, if you could assist us if you see any hands raised, that would be awesome. But I will read your question out loud, Julie. So Julie Winters asks, is VR required to help with transportation?
I don't, it's hard to say what they're required to do. The VR makes a plan, an employment plan with the individual. And if there is a goal that requires transportation, that's something they should definitely be looking at. But in terms of providing money and stuff, I think that there's internal policies. Obviously, in Maine, transportation is a huge issue, so it should be addressed in a VR plan if the person needs to travel to find work or to get work or to meet with people, towards work. Whether VR literally has to pay for it, I think it's a case by case example, a set situation where I don't, and there may be someone here in VR who's going to correct me. So I will say that my understanding is this is something that has to be looked at based on the individual plan.
What I can say about that is if you or somebody you know is experiencing transportation as a barrier to VR or to work, that is definitely something we would consider providing advocacy for. So, uh,
Absolutely.
yeah, and we have had. I mean, I think the case example was a good example, and I know we've had other successes making the case for ongoing solution to a transportation need so that individuals with disabilities can go to work.
Yeah, and I've also, we've worked on people who are using motive care to try to advocate for them to, have a better, better pickup system for that individual, or make sure they have an accessible van or accessible transportation for them. So we would get involved, but I would imagine this would be something that might be a collaborative process between VR and ourselves to try to find a solution to a barrier such as transportation. It's a tough one in Maine, though, and there's no question about it. But thanks for the question. Did that answer it? Kind of, sort of.
The other thing I will say is vocational rehab services are somewhat limited in time, meaning that they're really designed to get somebody who has a desire to work, and then once they've attained employment, VR at a certain point kind of goes away. So I think the the real question would become, right, how to make sure that whatever services that are provided are sustainable, and whatever, if an individual needs transportation, they're able to have that like solved in the long term, so that they can continue to work when VR services are concluded. And I know we've had, I'm not sure what year this was, but I know that we did have success advocating with VR to help somebody actually purchase a vehicle so they could drive themselves to work.
Any other questions in the chat or any hands raised? Okay. I'm saying there's probably none, but so the next training is next Wednesday, and I just want to give a little bit of a, foreshadowing of the training. We are going to be
Hi,
talking
Jane.
about.
Sorry, this is
Oh,
Harper. You
oh,
do
we
have
have
one
one. Oh,
question in
sorry.
the Q&A.
Okay.
I can read it out for you if you
Thank
want.
you.
It is from Adam. It says, they say they've been working with a client for a year now. He's been trying to get help from MVR, been through 3 job coaches now, about the same amount of time with and without a coach due to staffing, and the support they're receiving is paltry at best. At which point am I overstepping my bounds as CCM regarding duplication of services?
Well, that's probably a question for your supervisor, but I certainly would encourage you to ask, if the individual wishes to reach out to us, that would be something we could very much get involved in possibly. We'd have to talk to the individual and go through the intake process, but I don't know what I don't know if you're overstepping. That was kind of a discussion that at least I think would be something you'd have to look at your agency, etc. What do you think, Lucas?
Yeah, I would say in terms of advocating with VR, as long as the individual that you're working with, you know, is on board with that advocacy, I think you're probably not overstepping. But if they do want our assistance, please do reach out or have your client reach out and do an intake with us. This is definitely the kind of issue that we see a lot in our employment advocacy. And I think, you know, I'm not sure, depending on the client, I know there are sometimes several different ways for somebody to get like prepared to work or prepped for work, um, through community support programs and so forth, depending on the services they're eligible for and they're receiving. So that could also be something to explore if there's a way to make sure that this individual is working towards their employment goal and also working to advocate for themselves or get the support for with advocacy to make sure that VR is actually providing the services they're supposed to be.
Through these trainings, we hope we make some awareness that, it's great to hear that you're trying to, you're concerned about the situation and want to advocate, and then that's available to you, great. But if you feel like at this point they need a different kind of help, we would certainly be available to talk to the individual. And I guess this may be very obvious, but I've had some people really not know this, is really the only eligibility criteria in terms of the individual is that they have a disability. Obviously, then we get into our priorities and our capacity, but having a disability is our only really requirement, and it's a self-disclosed disability. And we are not, we are free. We don't cost money for the individual. We provide advocacy and representation and support. That's part of our funding. So, yeah, as I said, that may be very obvious and people may all know that, but sometimes it's important to say that. Anything else?
We have another question that I can see,
Okay.
and that is, are there any restrictions to participating in the State Rehabilitation Council? And can anyone participate? So I can start answering that. The State Rehabilitation Councils are by appointment. So if you're interested in joining, you can contact the, I'm going to you can contact them and request essentially a form that you can fill out to request to be appointed. And I don't have the information right in front of me, but I will make sure to send it out to you all who attended, who to contact if that is of interest.
And if you're interested in, the website that has this information is on the Department of Labor in the Maine government. It has the information about the State Rehabilitation Council on it. So if you go to the Department of Labor website, you should be able to find that under the Vocational Rehabilitation Division. So we can give that information out to everybody, as Lucas said. Excuse me. Anything else? So as next week, we're going to look at the VR process in more detail and how to navigate it. This is something we help a lot of clients with. So it might be an opportunity to learn about navigating the VR system if you are not aware of it, but also things you can provide for the individuals and things we can help individuals with as they try to access VR services and continue working with VR and get the most out of it. And this includes creating your individual employment plan and how to advocate for the things that that you want as a person with a disability. So I hope you come. I mean, I feel like I need to say this because this was a little awkward for me. I've never done the webinar type thing. So I apologize for any kind of technical things I did wrong or kind of not following the right way, but hopefully I'll be smoother next week because I've now done it once and I appreciate your patience with that. So thank you. Anything else?
I don't see any more questions. Harper, do we have any hands raised?
Oh,
All right.
only one more thank you in the chat.
Thank you.
And that seems like all.
All right, well, we ended a little early, so hopefully the 6 minutes available to you all will be put to good use. And I hope we see many of you next week. We look forward to it. Thank you.
So I think this is please, if you have an opportunity, fill out our training survey. It does give us good information about how we can be most effective and most accessible. So if you have time in these a little few extra minutes, maybe you could do that. I can stay, and we can leave the slide up. But feel free to also sign off if you're ready to move on with your afternoon. And I appreciate your time and attention very much. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.